Orchestrated entirely new story with fresh characters, setting and plot structure. Orchestrated entirely new story with fresh characters, setting and plot structure. 19 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday in March, and the woman stepping out of the silver car in front of the Cuthbert Athenaeum did not break stride to look at the man holding the door. She would not have called it cruelty. She would have called it order. There was a delegation behind her. 2 from the State Arts Endowment, a woman from the Savannah Preservation Board, a young reporter named Hollis Pruitt with a camera bag slung crosswise over his chest, and there was a reception at 10, and there was a man on the granite steps in a canvas work jacket and boots gone pale with sawdust, a long parcel wrapped in moving blankets balanced on one shoulder. Adeline Brooks took him in the way you take in a parked truck. She glanced at the boots, at the wrapped thing, at the leather satchel hanging off his other shoulder, and she said, in the level voice she used for everything, "Deliveries come through the service entrance, around the side." She lifted one hand toward the corner of the building without quite pointing. "We don't bring the trades through the lobby during a reception." The man looked at her for the length of one breath. He did not argue. He shifted the parcel an inch on his shoulder, nodded once like a man agreeing the weather had turned, and walked the way she had shown him, down the steps and along the limestone facade toward the side of the building, his free hand sliding into his jacket pocket. Hollis Pruitt let his camera drop on its strap a half-beat late, the way a person does when something has happened that he can't yet name. 2 hours before that, on the other side of the Wilmington River, the small kitchen of a clapboard house in Thunderbolt smelled like coffee and scorched butter. Silas Hargrove stood at the stove in a gray undershirt with the canvas jacket hanging over the back of a chair behind him, easing a fried egg loose with the edge of a spatula. The morning came in low and yellow over the marsh and laid a long stripe of it across the kitchen floor, across the table where his daughter sat with her chin nearly on the wood, lining up little blocks of cherry and maple. Offcuts from the shop, sanded smooth, the kind of thing other kids didn't have and didn't know to want. She was 8. She built the way her mother used to fold laundry, slow and exact, the tip of her tongue tucked into the corner of her mouth. "Daddy," she said, not looking up, "if you make the bottom out of softwood and the top out of hardwood, does it tip over?" He set the spatula down and came to look. She had a column of pine going up with a fat block of oak balanced on the very top of it. "Depends how true your joints are, Peanut. Softwood's fine on the bottom if it's flat and it's level. It's the lean that gets you, not the wood." He pressed the oak block down a hair with one finger so it sat square. "There, now it'll hold all morning." She studied it. "How do you know?" "Because I've built things that fell down," he said, "and things that didn't, and I learned the difference the hard way." On the wall above the table there was a framed photograph, a little sun-faded now. Silas younger by a decade, hair longer, and a woman beside him with the same gray-green eyes the girl had ended up with, and a toddler on his hip with her mouth wide open in a laugh. Behind the three of them rose the curved sweep of a staircase, raw oak, no railing yet, scaffolding still up around it, the day they'd topped out the great stair of the Athenaeum. Marin had been the one who'd told him to take that job when he'd been afraid of it. "You've been ready for years," she'd said. "You're just used to being scared." That was 11 years ago now, the staircase. 3 years and 4 months without her. Silas had gotten good at the arithmetic of mornings. Every breakfast was a small sum he did without meaning to. Every question the girl asked him was one Marin would have answered with more patience. 11, the girl announced, counting her column. "It holds at 11. "Sounds about right." At 7:45 he drove her over to Live Oak Elementary in the old white truck, the bed rattling with empty clamps. The marsh along the causeway was coming green at the edges. Wren talked the whole way about a field trip the next week. "We're going downtown, to the big library that isn't really a library, the one with the curly stairs." He kept his eyes on the road. "That'll be something." "You ever been there, Daddy?" A small pause. "I've been by it." He pulled up at the gate, fixed the twisted strap of her backpack, told her to actually eat the sandwich this time, and not just the cookie. She hugged him so hard it knocked the breath a little out of him, then ran for the door without looking back, which he had taught himself to be glad about. At 8:10 he unlocked Hargrove Joinery on Whitaker Street. The shop was small and clean and smelled of cut oak and beeswax and the cold metal smell of the bandsaw. Dewey, the one man he kept on full-time, was wrapping a finished newel post in furniture blankets. "Morning, boss. That Athenaeum piece is done. They called first thing. Wanted it today, not Thursday. Some kind of donor thing at 10. Dewey taped the last blanket down. Front office said bring it straight up to the second-floor gallery. Not through receiving. Guy named Tillman said so himself." Silas went still at the word Athenaeum. He hadn't set foot inside it since the year Marin got sick. He'd done the repair on this one piece, a cracked newel from the very stair he'd built, sent down to him quietly through a restoration contractor, and he'd told himself 100 times it was just wood, just a job, the same as any other. "I'll run it," he said. "You stay on the Habersham cabinets." He carried the wrapped post out to the truck himself and laid it across the bench seat like it was sleeping, and pointed the truck toward the Talmadge Bridge. At that same hour, 2 floors above Bull Street, Adeline Brooks stood at the long mirror in the general manager's office and checked the line of her jacket for the 3rd time. Charcoal wool, hair in a low knot, no jewelry but a thin steel watch. She'd laid the suit out the night before, the way she had laid out every morning for 5 months. Her assistant knocked once. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Ellison came in on the top floor at 7:45. He's asked not to be disturbed before 10. She turned from the mirror. "When was the last time he was in this building?" "5 months ago, ma'am, the day you started." She nodded and didn't ask him to finish the thought. Conrad Ellison did not come down from Charlotte to admire the architecture. He came to watch. 5 months and 1 day after he'd handed her the keys to the oldest cultural property his company owned, he was upstairs with a cup of coffee, and she knew exactly what that meant. For half a second she thought about the last interview. The boardroom in Charlotte, 6 months back, a director leaning forward and asking what she believed the worst weakness of a young executive was. She'd answered, without a pause, "Borrowed authority. People see how young you are before they see what you've done." The director hadn't smiled. He'd only written it down. Royce Tillman was in her doorway now, 51, soft in the middle, a tablet held against his chest like a hymnal. 3 things before the cars come. The endowment people moved up to 9. Pruitt from the paper confirmed, so we'll want the lobby clean. And there's a restoration delivery this morning, the newel for the gallery display. I told the shop to bring it up the front, save the freight elevator backing up. Adeline frowned the smallest amount. Straight up the front, why not receiving? "It's a rush. I figured you'd want it in place before the donors walked through." She let it go. She didn't ask which shop. She had no reason to. She lifted Herc from the chair and, for no reason she could have named, remembered the talk Royce had given her in her first week, the 2 of them in this office, him with one leg crossed over the other, his voice gentle as a kindly uncle. "The front of house is the face of the whole thing, Adeline. A donor never wants to see work clothes near the front door. I've held that line 11 years in this building. If you want the board to trust you, hold it tighter than I do." She had taken every word of advice the man had ever given her. She had thought it was generosity. At 5 of 9, she rode the elevator down. The endowment's cars were already turning off Bull onto the square. She stepped out the tall front doors into the hard, bright March light and lifted her chin to meet them. 7 stories up, Conrad Ellison stood at the window of the corner office with a coffee cup going cold in his hand. He watched the cars stop. He watched Adeline Brooks walk forward to greet the delegation, easy and composed, and he was about to turn away satisfied when something at the edge of the square caught his eye. A white pickup at the curb. A man climbing down out of it, sliding a long blanket-wrapped shape off the seat and up onto one shoulder, canvas jacket, sawdust on his boots even from up here, the particular careful way a man carries something he made with his own hands. Conrad Ellison set the coffee cup down on the sill very slowly and did not look away. 9:19. Deliveries come through the service entrance. Silas had nodded and walked. He didn't look back at her, didn't look at the people in good coats behind her, didn't change his face at all. He went along the limestone he had watched the masons set, around the corner past the iron planters he himself had argued for, to break the river wind 120 feet to the side door he had drawn into the plans with his own pencil 11 years ago. At the service entrance, Cora Banks was working the morning with a clipboard. Cora was 12 years on the door of this building, since the week it reopened, and she had been the one to hand Silas his commemorative key at the ribbon cutting. She looked up, the clipboard tilted in her hand. "Mr. Hargrove." The radio on her hip crackled. Royce Tillman's voice. "Cora, get that delivery handled quick. Don't let it back up the front." Cora's mouth went flat. She set the clipboard down and came over with both hands out for the post. "Mr. Hargrove, I am so sorry. I didn't know it was you bringing it." "It's all right, Cora. Good to see your face." He let her take the weight. "It's just a newel. Came loose. I fixed scarf joint. It'll hold another 100 years. She walked him in herself, past the freight cage, and on the way the elevator stopped on the second floor, and through the gap in the doors he could see his own staircase rising up through the gallery, the long oak curve of it catching the light, and he looked at it for exactly as long as the doors took to close, and then he handed the post to a young woman in a headset who never once looked at his face, and he turned and started back down toward the side door. 3 minutes later, in the front lobby, the executive elevator chimed. Adeline had the delegation gathered near the fountain for the photographs. Hollis Pruitt down on one knee with his camera up. The doors opened and Conrad Ellison stepped out. 75 years old, gray suit, white hair combed straight back, and the whole delegation turned toward him at once like grass turning in a wind. Adeline went forward with the smile she'd practiced. "Mr. Ellison, we're honored that you'd." He lifted one hand, not unkind, just a small flat gesture that meant wait, and he walked past her. He walked past the entire delegation, across the marble he'd paid to have polished, toward the corridor on the east side, and Silas Hargrove came out of it at that exact moment with his empty hands and his satchel and the dust on his boots. Conrad Ellison stopped in front of him and put out his hand. "Silas, forgive me for sending you around your own building like a stranger." The lobby went quiet, the fountain ran. Hollis Pruitt's shutter went twice, very fast. Silas took the old man's hand. He didn't smile. He tipped his head a half-inch, the way he might to a man he respected and hadn't seen in a long while. Conrad Ellison turned, kept his grip on Silas's hand a moment longer, and pitched his voice clear enough to carry. "Folks, before we go up, I'd like you to meet Silas Hargrove. He built the staircase you're about to stand under, every joint in it. He won the Georgia Trust Award for it the year we opened, and his name's cut into the cornerstone you walked over coming in." A woman from the Preservation Board, Imogen Reyes, was the first to move. She stepped out of the line and put out her hand. "Mr. Hargrove, this is a genuine pleasure." Then the endowment man, then the second one. Hollis Pruitt took 3 more frames and lowered the camera with an odd, careful look on his face, like a man who'd just understood that the picture he'd come for wasn't the one he was going to file. Adeline Brooks stood where she was. The color had gone out of her face. She could feel the cold of the marble coming up through the soles of her shoes. At the far end of the lobby, near the front desk, Royce Tillman had stopped walking. He took one small step back into the shadow of a column, and then he turned and went quickly toward the stairs. Conrad Ellison was already gathering the delegation toward the elevator, coffee waiting upstairs, and he offered the invitation to Silas with a tip of his head. Silas declined, polite as a closed door. "I've got to get my daughter at 3, but thank you." "You'll come back then?" "I will." He walked out through the tall front doors into the light. Adeline did not watch him go. She turned professional and waved the delegation toward the elevators, and Imogen Reyes fell in beside her, and in the rising car, Imogen watched the floor numbers climb and said quietly, "Mrs. Brooks, I think you and I ought to talk sometime this week." "Yes," Adeline said, "I think we should." She got the donors their coffee. She made the introductions she'd rehearsed for a fortnight. Conrad Ellison never once mentioned the lobby. He poured cream in his cup and asked the endowment man sharp questions about matching funds and never looked at her at all. At noon she went back to her office and shut the door and stood at the window a long time. Then she sat down and typed the name Silas Hargrove into the company archive. 31 results. Hargrove Joinery, Master Craftsman of Record, Great Stair and Reading Hall, Millwork, Cuthbert Athenaeum 2012-2014, Georgia Trust Excellence in Restoration 2014. A photograph of a man in a borrowed-looking blazer at a podium, a young woman beside him in a green dress, a little girl asleep against the woman's shoulder, and then near the bottom of the page an obituary. Maren Ellison Hargrove, Maren Cole Hargrove, survived by her husband Silas and her daughter Wren. 4 years ago this past November, the shop had gone from 9 employees to 2 within the year. Adeline sat very still. At 2 o'clock she drove herself across the Talmadge and out to Thunderbolt, found Hargrove Joinery on Whitaker, parked, and tried the door. Locked, a young man in a hoodie inside. Dewey waved her off through the glass and pointed at the hours sign. She stood there on the sidewalk in her charcoal coat in the March sun, feeling like an idiot. She took a card from her wallet, drew one clean line through her title with a pen, and wrote underneath in her own hand, "Mr. Hargrove, I owe you an apology that does not come from an assistant. A. Brooks." She slid it under the door and drove away. That evening at 6:15, Royce Tillman sat in his car in the parking garage, with his phone to his ear and a board director named Falk on the other end. "Lyle, we need to get ahead of this." She insulted Conrad's personal craftsman in front of the entire state endowment. "There's going to be a photo in the paper. I'm not making a thing of it, I'm just saying the optics. For a woman 5 months in." He listened a while. He smiled at the windshield. "Of course. I just wanted you to have the full picture." At that same hour, Silas opened his front door and let Wren run past him toward the kitchen and the cookie jar. He set the mail on the counter without looking at it. "Daddy," she called, "did you go in the building with the curly stairs today?" He kept his face even. "I did for a minute." "What's it like inside?" He thought about the marble, the fountain, the old man with his hand out, the staircase rising through the light that he had spent a year of his life learning how to bend. "It's a good building," he said. "You'll like it on your trip." Saturday came up bright and cold off the water. Adeline had not meant to go anywhere. She'd slept badly 2 nights running, lying awake with the picture of that marble floor and the thin line her whole career had quietly opened along. At 9, she put on jeans for the first time in 5 months and walked the few blocks to the public library on Bull Street to pick up a book she'd had on hold since January. The children's room was at the back, past the stairs, and she had no intention of going near it. She was after the new release shelf by the window, but she heard the laugh first, a small bright one, and a lower one under it, dry and surprised, and she knew that second laugh the way you know a song you've only heard once. She'd heard it for 1 second in the lobby on Tuesday, just before everything went sideways, and she had not expected to hear it again outside of a personnel file. She stopped at the end of the picture book aisle. Silas sat cross-legged on the rug in jeans and a flannel with the sleeves shoved up, and Wren was tucked against his side with a book open across both their laps, sounding out a word too big for her. Cantilever. And missing it. And her father saying it again slow, the way a man says a word to a child he knows is going to grow up loving it. She tried it once more and got it close enough that he laughed, and that was the laugh Adeline had heard. Wren looked up first. She looked at Adeline with no recognition at all and a great deal of frank interest, the way kids do. She closed the book carefully. She did everything carefully, and stood and came over. "That lady's coat is nice," she said to no one. Then to Adeline, "Do you like books about building? This one's about a girl who builds a bridge out of toothpicks, and then a real bridge falls down somewhere else and they call her to fix it." Adeline crouched down to the girl's height. "I haven't read that one." "You should, my dad reads it to me. He builds real stairs." She turned. "Daddy, this lady might like the bridge book." Silas had gotten to his feet by then. He stood at the end of the aisle with one hand in his pocket and the book still in the other, his hair damp at the temples like he'd come straight from the shower, and his face was neither warm nor cold. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." They looked at each other over the top of Wren's head for a long second. Wren missed it entirely. She was already crouched at the bottom shelf hunting for something else. "I didn't know who you were on Tuesday," Adeline said low. "That isn't an excuse." "No," he said, "it isn't." Wren glanced up at the change in their voices. "Do you know my daddy?" "I met him this week," Adeline said carefully. "At his work." The girl considered that. "He doesn't really go to work, he makes things." She said it like a kindness she was doing him. The corner of Silas's mouth moved a fraction. "That's about right, Peanut." Adeline bought the book the girl had picked out. At the desk she found, penciled small in the bottom corner of the title page, a single careful letter, W. Wren had been marking the books she loved in this library, it seemed, for some time, the way some children leave a trail so they can find their way back to good things. The librarian saw the mark and smiled and said nothing, and slid the book into a paper bag. Outside, Adeline sat down on a bench under a live oak, and held the bag on her knees and did not open it for a long while. Bull Street went by in its slow Saturday way. A man with a dog. 2 girls on bicycles. None of them looked at her, which was, she thought, the whole point of everything she'd been getting wrong. On Monday, Conrad Ellison had Silas brought up to the office and offered him the consulting role on the old Selden ice house down on the river, a dead brick hulk the company meant to bring back as a public market and music hall. Silas shook his head before the old man finished. "I don't sign drawings anymore, Conrad. You know that. I'm not asking for your signature. I'm asking for your eye." Silas was quiet a long time. Through the window the river ran the color of pewter under a flat sky. "Part-time," he said at last. "I pick my daughter up at 3 every day. That part doesn't move." 3 o'clock written into the contract. The project would be run jointly out of the Athenaeum's offices. Adeline Brooks was the operational lead. Silas would work 4 mornings a week from a small drafting room on the 5th floor. He started Tuesday. For a week the two of them worked side by side and barely spoke. She brought him drawings. He marked them with a soft pencil, light as breathing. She watched him read a floor plan, the way another man might read a face. He could tell her in 2 sentences why the market hall would feel cavernous and lonely at dusk, even though it was lovely at noon, and exactly which way to turn the entrance so the river wind didn't slam the doors all winter. She started writing down the things he said. On Thursday they worked late. Around 9 she ordered Vietnamese up to the little drafting room and set 2 paper containers on the table between them. The floor had gone quiet 2 hours back. Only the cleaners moved at the far end, the soft drone of a vacuum somewhere on the other side of the building. She asked him about Marin, gently, sideways. He set his chopsticks down. He took a while. "She was sick about a year. I was down in Brunswick most of it, finishing a courthouse stair. Kept telling myself I'd wrap it by spring and then I'd be home for whatever came." He turned the container a quarter turn on the table. "Spring came. I wasn't home enough. I'm sorry. It's an old grief now. It's got its own room. I just visit it." He picked the chopsticks back up. She'd have liked this building, the ice house. She liked the broken ones. Adeline didn't push. She picked at her food and watched him for a second longer than she meant to, the desk lamp behind him catching the gray she hadn't noticed before. And then, after a silence, she told him about her mother, a seamstress in a department store in Macon, alterations counter, on her knees with pins in her mouth most days. A customer once handed her a folded bill and told her to do better work next time. "Do you understand me?" And her mother had said thank you and tucked the money in her apron and smiled. "I was 12, Adeline said. "I watched her smile at that man, and I told myself I would never, ever be the one standing on his side of that counter." She looked at her hands on the table. "And Tuesday morning, on the steps I was him." Silas looked at her a while across the table. "Funny thing," he said. "Spend your whole life that scared of turning into something, you forget to watch the door it comes in by." She didn't answer. She picked her chopsticks back up and looked at the plans. Down the hall, Royce Tillman was passing with a folder under his arm. He stopped. He looked through the narrow glass beside the door at the two of them under the lamp. He took out his phone and held it up to the glass. No flash, no sound. Then he lowered it and walked on. Cora Banks, coming out of the supply room across the corridor, with an armload of fresh letterhead, saw him do it. She saw him raise the phone and lower it and go. She stood there a moment with the paper against her chest and her mouth set hard. She had 12 years in this building. She had 2 months left before her contract came up for its next renewal, and Royce Tillman was the man whose name went on it. She carried the letterhead back into the supply room, set it down, took out her own phone, and started very methodically writing down dates. The board hearing was set for the following Thursday at 10, in the conference room on the top floor. Royce Tillman had filed a formal concern with the parent company in Charlotte, executive conduct and reputational risk, and attached 2 photographs taken through the glass, time-stamped, captioned "Inappropriate Proximity," with a memo noting that the general manager had publicly humiliated the chairman's personal craftsman before the State Arts Endowment, and now appeared to be conducting a private relationship with the same man. Adeline read the memo at 6 in the morning at her kitchen counter, with a cup of black coffee going cold. She read it twice. She rinsed the cup and dressed in the navy she wore when she expected to bleed a little. Silas got a short email from Conrad at 8 summoning him to the same room at the same hour, no reason given. He drove across the bridge with his hands light on the wheel. They met in the corridor outside the conference room at 5 of 10. Adeline lifted her eyes to his for 1 second and looked away. Silas held the door for her. Inside, the long table was already lined with directors. Falk at one end, hands folded, Royce Tillman at the other in a charcoal suit, with the smallest careful smile on his face. The board chair read the charges out in a flat, tired voice. Public humiliation of a senior associate of the parent chairman, conduct unbecoming the role, a personal entanglement compromising the neutral operation of the property. Adeline raised her hand to speak. She took full responsibility on the record for what she'd said on the steps. She rejected on the record the second charge entirely. The chair nodded and turned to Silas. There was a knock at the door, and Cora Banks opened it without waiting to be asked. She came in wearing her gray uniform jacket with a thin folder under one arm. She did not look at Royce. "My apologies for interrupting, sir. There's something the board ought to have before this goes any further." She laid the folder on the table. "On Tuesday the 11th, at 8:51 in the morning, Mr. Tillman instructed me over the radio to send Mr. Hargrove around to the service entrance, knowing Mr. Hargrove was the man who built the staircase. I've got the radio log printed here." She turned a page. "On Thursday the 20th at 9:16 in the evening, Mr. Tillman photographed Ms. Brooks and Mr. Hargrove through the glass of the fifth-floor drafting room. I watched him do it. On Friday the 21st, he emailed a freelance reporter named Caleb Voss offering exclusive details on his words a developing situation at the Athenaeum. The forwarded email is in the folder. And over that same weekend he placed 4 calls to Director Falk's private line, 39 minutes in all." She paused. "I've kept quiet because my renewal's up in 2 months, and Mr. Tillman is the man who signs it. I've worked the door of the building Mr. Hargrove built for 12 years. I'm not going to stand there and watch it used to take down a second good person." Royce Tillman stood. "This is absurd. The woman runs a security desk." The door at the back of the room opened. Conrad Ellison walked in. He didn't say anything right away. He walked to the head of the table, stood behind the chair's seat, and looked the length of the room at Royce. "Sit down, Royce." Royce sat. Conrad turned to the board. "I've had Mr. Tillman's communications under quiet review for the better part of a year. Ms. Banks's documentation lines up with everything my office already has. Mr. Tillman is suspended without pay, effective now, pending a referral on tortious interference." He turned to Adeline, and his face did not soften an inch. "Mrs. Brooks, I hired you because I believed you'd come from a place you wouldn't forget. On those steps you forgot. I'll trust these last 2 weeks have reminded you why I picked you in the first place." Adeline held his eyes. "I won't forget again." "See that you don't." He looked at Silas and the corner of his mouth moved. "My apologies, Silas, for the second time this month." "Accepted," Silas said, "for the second time." The board adjourned. Royce Tillman was walked out through the front lobby by building security in full view of the morning staff. Cora Banks watched him go from her post with nothing at all on her face. That evening, Adeline left the building at 7 and crossed the front lobby on foot for the first time in 5 months, at the pace of a person no longer in any hurry. She looked up at the ceiling height. She looked at the proportion of the columns. She looked at the warm low light Silas had specified for the end of the day and understood finally that he had built this room to be kind to people who were tired. Cora was still at the desk. "Thank you, Cora." Cora looked up. She didn't smile. She tipped her head a half-inch, the same half-inch she'd given a nervous young craftsman 12 years ago on his first walkthrough, and went back to her log. Silas was out front on the sidewalk waiting on a rideshare, hands in his jacket, looking up the square at nothing. "Let me drive you home," Adeline said. He looked at her. He nodded. She took the truck. He handed her the keys without comment, across the Talmadge with the windows half down. The harbor air came in cold and salt clean. The lights of the city fell away behind them, and the bridge cables went by overhead in long even pulses of orange. For a while neither of them said anything. The radio was off. "Wren asked me a question last night," Silas said. "What'd she ask?" "Asked if you were the lady from the bridge book." Adeline kept her eyes on the road. "What did you tell her?" "Told her I didn't know yet. I don't make my girl promises I can't keep." Adeline nodded, slow. "That's the right answer," she said. He didn't reply. She came off the bridge and onto the Thunderbolt Road, dark and hung with oaks, the air smelling of low tide. She pulled up at the curb in front of the narrow clapboard house with the porch light on. Before he opened the door, he turned to her. "You know why I didn't fight you on those steps?" "Why?" "Because I built that side door. I knew exactly where it went, and exactly how it'd look, and exactly how long the walk was. I trusted the building to say the thing I wasn't going to say myself. He looked out at the porch light, and if the old man hadn't come down, then I'd have driven home and made my daughter dinner. I quit waiting on buildings to stand up for me a long time ago. Tuesday was a gift. I don't know whose. She turned to look at him properly for the first time all night. The dash light caught the line of his jaw, and that gray at his temple she kept not noticing. "Good night, Adeline." He got out and shut the door soft behind him. She sat with her hands on the wheel and watched him go up the path. The front door opened. A small head in pajamas appeared at his hip, and he bent and scooped Wren up in one easy motion and carried her in, and the downstairs lamp went out. A minute later, a smaller light came on upstairs. Wren's room, awake. Through the curtain, Adeline could just make out the shape of him sitting down on the edge of the bed. She sat at the curb almost 5 minutes before she put the truck in drive. 7 weeks later, on the first Saturday in May, the Selden Ice House opened with a small ceremony. The morning was cool and the river light was silver. The old brick had been carved open into a soaring market hall, the riverside all tall windows, the original cast iron columns running in 2 long rows the length of the floor, repainted soft black and left bare. Silas had spent the 7 weeks redrawing the way people would move around those columns. He hadn't signed a single page. He'd marked them all in soft pencil and handed them back to the staff architect, whose name would go on the block. Adeline stood at the front entrance at 9:45 in a long gray coat. She'd asked Silas and Wren to come as her guests. Conrad Ellison was already inside going over the program. A small crowd of donors and neighbors was gathering under the brick portico. The white truck pulled up at 5:10. Wren got out first, in a navy dress and white tights, a little notebook clutched to her chest, and she ran straight at Adeline and threw both arms around her legs. Adeline crouched down. "Hey, Peanut." "Hi." Wren leaned back to look at her. "Daddy says this is the building you and him made." "Your dad made it. I just kept the lights on." Wren weighed that. That's important too, she decided. Silas came up behind her in a clean scarf and a gray jacket. He'd shaved. He looked at the brick the way a man looks at a face he hasn't seen in years. Adeline stood and held out her hand. He looked at it. He hesitated 1 beat, not coldly at all, and then he took it. Wren took his other hand without being asked, and the 3 of them went in through the front doors together. Conrad Ellison spoke briefly inside, under the central skylight. He thanked the donors, and then he named Silas, plainly, the way he said everything, and said the building would not have come back without him, and the room clapped. Adeline spoke last. She had a single page of notes in her hand and didn't look at it once. "I've learned something these last couple of months," she said. "The way you greet a person at the door is the way you'll run everything behind it. This place was built to let people in. I'd like to run it the same way." She didn't look at Silas. The room clapped politely and went back to its coffee. Afterward, Silas walked the length of the hall slow, hands in his pockets, looking up at his own old iron columns, and he put his palm flat against one of them once and then moved on, and stopped at the far window where the river came up close to the brick, and stood there a good while not saying anything. Adeline let him have it. She was starting to understand that some of his quiet wasn't quiet at all, but a man stepping back into a room she hadn't been invited into. Wren followed him over after a bit and stood beside him at the glass, and he crouched and pointed at the base of one of the columns and told her something low, and she nodded, very serious, and tipped her head to look at it the same way he was looking at it. After a while she tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, can Miss Adeline come get pancakes with us?" Silas looked over at the woman. Wren nodded, very small, like it was already decided, and she was just being polite about it. The diner 2 blocks up smelled like butter and burnt sugar, and the 3 of them took the table by the window. Wren opened her notebook and went to work with the focus of an artist on commission, lining up her 2 stub pencils beside the blank page and frowning at it the way her father frowned at a blank plan. Silas ordered coffee for the grown-ups and a short stack for Wren. The waitress asked the girl what she was drawing, and Wren said she didn't know yet, and the waitress said that was the best way to start anything. They talked, low and practical, about the second phase. Silas would consult again, same terms, part-time, 3 o'clock pickup. Adeline would run it from the company side. It was a careful, useful conversation, and neither of them was being careful or useful about one single other thing in their lives at that table. and they both knew it, and the practical talk was a small kindness they were doing each other while they figured out the rest. There was a long quiet. Wren drew outside the window. A man went by with a dog. A woman in a red coat looked in at the pies and kept walking. "What are you making, Peanut?" Silas asked. She held up one finger almost. She finished her line, turned the notebook around, and slid it across the chip table to her father, then nudged it a quarter turn so Adeline could see too. 3 people in front of a long, low building by a river. A man in a flannel shirt, a small girl in a dress, a woman with a hand resting on the girl's shoulder, 2 birds in the sky over the roof, and an oak tree off to the side with most of its leaves still to come. Adeline looked at the drawing and didn't say anything for a moment. Silas looked at it. He looked at his daughter, who was already turning the page to draw a small cat in the corner of the next sheet, paying neither of them any mind. He spoke low, just for the woman across the table. "You don't have to keep looking for the door, Adeline. You're already inside." She set her hand down on the table between the 2 coffees, slow, palm down, the way a person sets down something they're afraid of breaking. Silas laid his hand over it, not all the way, just at the knuckles, light as a question. She didn't move her hand. Wren drew her cat. She gave it whiskers and a long curled tail and a little crown, and she didn't look up, and the window held the 3 of them in the soft river light, and behind them the diner rolled its ordinary Saturday morning forward, and somewhere between a side door and a front door the 2 of them had quit pretending they didn't want to be found. I keep coming back to the moment Silas Hargrove just nodded and walked. No argument, no speech, no demand that anyone go read the cornerstone with his name carved into it. For a while I figured a man like that was only proud, or worn down, or both. But the longer I sat with it, the more I understood he was something rarer than proud. He was settled. He knew exactly who he was, whether or not the woman on those granite steps did, and that quiet certainty is its own kind of muscle, the kind you only ever build by outlasting hard things. He had buried Marin. He had watched his shop shrink from 9 people to 2. A long walk to a side door was never going to break a man who had already carried that across a bridge every morning. That was the first thing this story put in front of me. The decency you show when nobody important is watching is the only decency that ever counted. Adeline Brooks learned it the expensive way. She didn't wake up meaning to be cruel. She meant to be correct. To hold a line a slicker man named Royce Tillman had handed her and called wisdom. And she found out that being correct and being good are not the same animal. The reason her fall landed so hard was plain cause and effect. She had spent 5 months waving in the right coats and waving off the wrong boots. And one ordinary Tuesday, the wrong boots belonged to the man who had built the very room she was standing in. Here's the part I love, though. The story didn't stop at her humiliation, and it didn't take a miracle to set her straight. It took her thinking. Going home, sitting in the shame, driving across the water, sliding a card under a locked door with her title crossed out by her own hand. That isn't weakness. That's the slow, unglamorous work of an honest mind correcting itself, and we don't talk enough about how much good judgment actually costs a person. And none of it would have turned without Cora Banks. 12 years on a door, 2 months from a renewal she needed, and she walked into that boardroom anyway with a folder full of dates. We like to believe justice comes sweeping down from the top in a gray suit, the way Conrad Ellison did. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly it comes from somebody small who decided that staying quiet cost more than speaking. So when Wren slid that drawing across the diner table, 3 people in front of a building by a river, I didn't see a happy ending handed to anybody. I saw one earned. Silas earned it by enduring. Adeline earned it by changing her mind and doing the harder thing. Cora earned it by being brave on a regular Thursday. We can each be one of those 3, and most days that's enough.